Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking a pretty different approach. We're not so much talking about how to do qualitative research.
No, not at all.
We're talking about the world it lives in, the institutional, ethical, and political battlefield where this kind of work actually happens.
That's absolutely right. We're pulling from some really foundational sources, especially the Sage Handbook of Qualitative Research, to get beyond just the methods.
Right.
We want to understand the deep systemic tensions that really define what it means to do rigorous inquiry today.
So for you listening, the big takeaway here is that choosing a qualitative method is, well, it's never a neutral act. It's always a decision that's got political and ethical commitments baked right into it.
Exactly. And we're going to break that down by looking at three central tensions that our sources really highlight.
Okay, so the first one, we're going to look at the current crisis of what's called the neoliberal academy
Hmm.
and the really radical solution that some of the biggest thinkers in the field are proposing, which is action research.
Then second, we're going to trace the history. And it's a surprisingly fraught history of qualitative methods.
It really is.
We'll trace it all the way back. And that means confronting some uncomfortable origins in, colonial ethnography and how that baggage still affects things.
And finally, we get to the big one, the critical ethical crossroads.
The big one for sure.
This is all about the move away from the old and, frankly, failure-prone Enlightenment model of ethics.
Right. Towards a much more demanding framework that scholars like Clifford Christians call a sacred epistemology. It's a huge concept that promises universal dignity and demands restorative justice.
So our mission today is to pull out those critical aha insights, the ones that really show you the stakes, ethically and politically, that are hiding just beneath the surface of rigorous inquiry.
Let's jump in.
Okay, so let's start where the research starts. In the university, the sources make a claim that's pretty impossible to ignore.
They do.
They say the academy is in a state of crisis. And this isn't, just about budget cuts.
No, it's much, much deeper than that.
Yeah.
It's really a fundamental failure of purpose. And it's driven by applying market logic to intellectual work.
And the sources point to a root cause for this, right?
They do. It's the rise of evidence-based research as the sort of gold standard. Now, that phrase, it sounds great. It sounds rigorous and scientific.
Of course. Who could be against evidence?
Exactly. But in practice, what it's done is it's tied university funding directly to the kinds of metrics and deliverables that private sector organizations love.
So the university is now playing by corporate rules, chasing corporate funding. But how does that actually break the traditional academic mission? What's the damage?
Well, it forces the university into a very specific model, a positivist, value-free science model,
Meaning,
meaning a model that's designed for quantifiable, replicable outcomes, things that can be immediately marketed or, turned into a product.
and when you're chasing those kinds of outcomes, you need a system to manage it all.
You do. And that pursuit leads to what the sources call a bloated, inefficient administrative infrastructure. It's an army of administrators designed just to manage compliance, track metrics, and measure KPIs. The focus just shifts completely from critical thinking to institutional throughput.
You're basically describing a university that's trying to be a business, a corporate engine, instead of an engine for critical thought.
That's a perfect way to put it. And because it's chasing this business model, the sources argue it's actually failing at what it's supposed to do, its traditional accomplishments.
Let's talk about that. What's a traditional accomplishment that gets lost?
Think about the concept of Bildung. It's a German idea.
Okay.
It's about self-formation, about critical education. The whole point of a traditional university was to cultivate students' minds, to produce informed, morally responsible, critically thinking citizens.
And you can't really measure that with a spreadsheet.
You can't. It's slow, it's reflective, it's unquantifiable. So when the university is geared towards corporate metrics, immediate deliverables, intellectual property, economic utility building just dies.
So that's where qualitative research gets squeezed out. Because it's messy by its very nature. It doesn't fit the model.
Precisely. If knowledge has to be objective and quantifiable to get funding, then any kind of inquiry that's subjective, that's contextual, that's focused on the richness of a story, it just gets devalued.
Okay, so the system is broken. It's a pretty bleak picture. What's the path forward? What's the prescription that thinkers like Levin and Greenwood propose?
They champion something called action research, or AR.
And this is presented as a kind of antidote.
A radical corrective, yeah.
Mhm.
It's designed to survive and even thrive outside that whole positivist metric system. It's defined by the responsibility to do work that is, and this is key, socially meaningful and socially responsible.
So what's the big difference? AR isn't about just studying society from a
And
distance.
not at all. It's about fundamentally changing the relationship between the researcher, the university, and the community. Political engagement, social change, those aren't just side effects.
Yeah.
They are the core of the method. They're the vehicle for transformation.
That sounds incredibly ambitious. If the university is demanding these quantifiable deliverables, isn't calling for a radical reconstruction just setting yourself up for failure, how does AR even survive?
That is the fundamental tension, you're right. And AR researchers live in that tension. But Levin and Greenwood argue that survival comes from shifting your allegiance
Away from the university.
towards the community. Action researchers are committed to material practices that are focused on producing democratizing transformations in the real world. That means the university might demand compliance, but the AR researchers' first accountability is to the community they're working with.
Can you give us an example? Let's say a traditional study on urban poverty versus an action research approach. How would they differ?
Great question. So a traditional study might have a sociologist go in, collect a bunch of demographic data, do some interviews, and then, go back to the university and publish a paper about the structural causes of poverty.
The researcher is the expert. The community provides the data.
Exactly. The outcome is an objective text, a grant deliverable. An action research project, though, it would start with the community itself. The residents would jointly define the problem. Maybe it's inadequate housing, maybe it's a lack of city resources.
So the community members aren't subjects to be studied. They're, what, co-participants?
They're stakeholders. They're co-researchers. They're involved in turning the inquiry into what's called praxis.
And praxis is.
It's a vital term. It means practical, reflective, pragmatic action that's aimed at solving problems in the world right now. The knowledge they create together is co-constructed. It's grounded in local knowledge, and it has to be pragmatically useful to that community immediately.
That feels like a direct assault on that old value-free positivist model. If I'm a dean in a neoliberal academy, I want universal findings I can sell. AR is delivering these super specific community-led solutions.
And that's the tension. That's the fight. AR isn't abandoning rigor. It's just redefining it. Levin and Greenwood are calling for a civil social science, a pragmatic science that leads to the radical reconstruction of the university's relationship with the community and the state.
So it's a way for the university to rediscover its public purpose by getting out of its corporate silo.
That's the argument. That's how the academy, in its current crisis, might find its way back.
It's a powerful vision.
Yeah.
But to really get why that kind of radical change is so necessary, you have to look backwards, right? You have to understand the field's really deep and often pretty uncomfortable origins.
You absolutely do. You can't chart a new course without grappling with the historical baggage.
So we tend to think of qualitative methods, intensive interviews, field observation as being products of the 20th century.
Right, that they're relatively new. But the sources, drawing on Vittich and Lyman, they insist on a much, much longer trajectory. An ancient one, really.
Ancient? How far back are we talking?
Well, the impulse to observe and categorize the other goes all the way back to the Greeks. But the modern systematic version of qualitative inquiry, especially ethnography, that really gets its start in the 15th and 16th centuries.
And what's happening then?
It's when Westerners, mostly European empires, developed a really focused interest in studying and, more importantly, defining so-called primitive cultures. And this is where the methodology becomes impossible to separate from the mechanics of power and empire.
So the spread of these methods, these early qualitative methods, it just mirrors the spread of empire.
Perfectly. Spain, England, France, Holland. The methods grew right alongside the colonial projects.
So there's a direct, undeniable link.
It's what some might call the original sin of the field. And throughout this imperial history, the early ethnographers all shared a specific set of beliefs. They were committed to objectivism. This idea that they could just show up and capture a pure, unbiased reality.
And they wanted to meticulously contextualize everything, create these super detailed accounts of life.
Right. And then they were always ready to interpret, theoretically, to fit all that local data into their grand, Western-made theories of how societies develop.
And there's the insidious part, isn't it? Those commitments, objectivism, context, theory, they were needed to make the work seem scientific back home, but they also hid the oppressive power dynamic that was always there. The scientist was always in charge.
Always. And this is where Erickson's analysis of the 6 foundational footings of early QR is so important. These were the pillars that this early, often colonial research was built on.
Okay, let's walk through them. What's the first one?
The first is disciplinary perspectives. This was mainly sociology and anthropology, two fields that really grew up hand in hand with the colonial enterprise.
And the second.
The second is the participant observational field worker. This person was the observer, the collector of facts, and the sole authoritative author of the final text. This is a huge point of contention today.
Why is that role, the observer-author, so heavily debated now?
Because it's all about privilege. The classical model assumed that a researcher, usually a white man from Europe or America, could just enter a community, observe it neutrally, and then go home and write the definitive, objective truth about that culture.
It required the researcher to be seen as completely detached, almost godlike, an omniscient narrator.
Exactly. Speaking for the people, often without their real consent or any kind of real participation.
Okay, so what's the third footing?
The people observed, who in this context were almost always the subjects of this colonial or paternalistic gaze. Fourth is the rhetorical and substantive content of the texts themselves,
The stories that were told.
and the language used to tell them, which so often framed the people being observed as primitive or exotic or childlike.
And footing number 5 is critical, the audiences. Who are these texts for?
Almost never the community being studied. The audience was other Western academics or imperial administrators or government officials who were making policy decisions about those communities.
So the knowledge was fundamentally extractive. It was taken from one place and used in another for the benefit of the powerful.
Precisely. Which brings us to the sixth footing, the underlying worldview, the ontology, the epistemology, the whole purpose of the research. These six things together created what's called the realist ethnographic text, a genre that is now under, as the sources say, considerable attack.
And that attack is what we call the postmodern turn.
Right. The field just couldn't ignore its complicity with colonialism and positivism anymore. It had to fundamentally rethink itself. And the critique wasn't just about methods. It was deeply philosophical.
Which brings us to this idea of the humanist inquiring subject. What does that mean, and how did post-structuralist thinkers blow it up?
Well, the Enlightenment, the humanist tradition, it assumed that the individual, the researcher, was this autonomous, rational, constant being, capable of objective, value-free observation.
The omniscient narrator again.
Exactly. But then thinkers like Foucault and Deleuze come along, and as St. Pierre argues, they show that the self isn't constant at all. Our sense of who we are, our language, our desires, even what we're able to see and observe, it's all constructed by power and discourse.
So if the self isn't this stable, rational thing, if it's shaped by power, then the idea of a neutral researcher standing outside of it all, just recording data, that's a philosophical impossibility.
It's a fiction. The realist ethnographic text is no longer acceptable because it hides the researcher's own position, their own complicity. So qualitative inquiry can't just be about describing things anymore. It has to be about self-reflection, about critique, about revealing the power structures that shape everyone involved, including the observer.
And this critique didn't kill the field. It actually forced it to diversify, right? That's where we get those 7 major contemporary streams of QR.
It's the proof that the field is taking self-critique seriously. I mean, look at the diversity now. You have critical ethnography, collaborative action research, indigenous studies.
Which flips the whole model on its head by having insiders do the research.
Right. And you have autoethnography, where the researcher becomes the subject, performance ethnography, arts-based approaches. All of these are explicitly designed to counteract those 6 historical footings of privilege.
So this constant self-reflection, this grappling with its own past, is why modern qualitative research is so ethically demanding. It has to constantly prove it has escaped its own history.
And that demand for a new kind of ethical rigor, for a framework that can actually prevent the abuses baked into its colonial and positivist past, that's what leads us to the third major tension, the total collapse of the old Enlightenment ethical model.
Okay, so when we're talking about research ethics, we're basically talking about the rules that govern the relationship between a researcher and the people they're studying. And for centuries, the dominant idea was the Enlightenment model.
That's right. If you look at research ethics before, say, the 1980s, the whole thing was governed by a few really simple, but as it turns out, deeply insufficient concepts. Positivism demanded that inquiry be value-free, and the moral compass was mostly utilitarianism.
Okay, break that down for us. Utilitarianism in a research context.
It's the ethical theory that says an action is morally right if it produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people.
The ends justify the means.
In a nutshell, yes. So in research, this meant that if a study could produce valuable knowledge that might benefit society as a whole, then the potential suffering or deception of a few individuals was often seen as an acceptable price to pay.
And this model, this idea of the greater good, it created the conditions for some really profound abuses.
Absolutely. Which is what led directly to the creation of institutional review boards, or IRBs, in the 1980s.
The structures we all know today.
Right. And IRBs were driven by federal law. They mandated things we now take for granted, like informed consent, non-deception, and the absence of physical or psychological harm. But the very fact that we needed IRBs is a monument to the failure of that underlying utilitarian model.
And to really understand that failure, we have to look at the specific historical events that made it impossible to ignore anymore.
We do. Because these are what shattered the illusion of detached, value-free science.
Let's talk about them.
Well, the list is tragically long. Of course, you have the Nazi medical experiments, which really set the first global standard for what was absolutely unacceptable. But we have to acknowledge the research tragedies that happened right here.
Like the Tuskegee syphilis study.
The Tuskegee study is the starkest example. For decades, researchers deliberately withheld treatment from hundreds of African American men just to see how the disease progressed. It's a horrifying example of utilitarianism sacrificing individuals for the sake of data.
And that was a medical study. But social science has its own scandals that show the failure of the model in a qualitative context.
It does. Stanley Milgram's deception experiments are a classic example from psychology. But for social scientists, a case like Lord Humphrey's tea room trade is it's deeply troubling.
What happened there?
Humphrey studied gay men in public restrooms. He gained their trust by deception, by acting as a lookout for them. And then he secretly recorded their license plate numbers so he could track them down a year later and interview them at their homes under false pretenses.
A massive violation of privacy, of dignity, of consent.
A complete violation, all done in the name of advancing sociological knowledge.
And the sources are clear that this isn't just ancient history. These problems, things like fraud, plagiarism, data tampering, they continue to this day.
Which suggests that even the IRBs, our institutional fix, are still struggling with the deep ethical poverty of the model they were built on.
This is where the critique from Clifford Christians comes in. He argues that the Enlightenment model is fundamentally impoverished.
It's impoverished because its focus on abstract, value-free outcomes creates the very conditions for deception. Utilitarianism will always risk sacrificing the dignity of the subject for the perceived benefit of the data.
So if that framework failed because it was too abstract and didn't protect the individual, what's the replacement? Christians proposes an ethic based on feminist communitarianism.
And this is a huge philosophical shift. Feminist communitarianism puts the emphasis on social justice, social action, restorative justice, and positive change. And crucially, it argues that the community is, get this, axiologically and ontologically prior to the person.
Wow. Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It means our moral values, our axiology, and our very understanding of reality, our ontology, are rooted in the community first, not the individual. So it centers values like care and shared governance and solidarity in every single research project.
And this leads directly to that radical term you mentioned earlier, sacred epistemology. It sounds almost religious.
It moves research into a totally different relationship with the world. It's about placing ourselves in a non-competitive, non-hierarchical relationship with the earth, with nature, with other people. In research terms, it means empowerment, shared governance, and community involvement are non-negotiable at every step.
It's a whole philosophical anthropology. It declares that all humans are worthy of dignity and sacred status, without exception. But how does that translate into actual research rules that are different from what an IRB already requires?
Well, standard IRB rules are mostly prohibitive. They're a list of don'ts. Don't deceive, don't harm.
Yeah.
Sacred epistemology is prescriptive. It's a list of musts. It demands that research be built on a universal human ethic, justice, truth, nonviolence, but also on locally experienced, culturally specific protocols. And because it centers dignity, it must actively interrogate how systems of oppression like race, class, and gender are operating in that research site.
And you mentioned this framework demands restorative justice, not traditional justice. What's the difference?
Traditional justice, what the sources call right-order justice, is usually procedural. It's about rules, merit, who deserves what, It's focused on retribution or making sure the process was fair.
So for Tuskegee, a right order response would be to pay reparations and fire the people responsible.
Exactly. But it might leave the underlying power structures that allowed it to happen totally intact.
And restorative justice.
Restorative justice is a radical alternative. It's focused on healing, on repairing the harm, on social transformation. It means the research itself must actively work to give every participant their due, not just procedurally, but structurally. It has to be designed to heal the harm caused by existing power systems, not just study them.
That is an incredibly high bar for a researcher. It means prioritizing ethical outcomes over just checking the boxes for institutional compliance.
It is.
Which brings us right to the collision point.
Oh, yeah, right.
The regulatory reality of the IRBs themselves.
And here's the great irony. The very structures that are supposed to ensure ethical research, the IRBs, they come from the Belmont Report and the Common Rule.
Which were designed to prevent biomedical harm.
Exactly. They are designed to stop another drug trial disaster. But their application to social science has been, to put it mildly, heavily criticized.
How does a rule that makes sense for a clinical trial end up constraining a qualitative researcher who's just doing interviews?
The problem is that the rules often can't distinguish between physical risk and what you might call contextual risk.
Okay.
An IRB will demand a detailed consent form, full disclosure of purpose, strict anonymity. For a biomedical study, that makes perfect sense. But for a qualitative researcher working on social justice issues, those same requirements can be destructive.
How so? Give me an example.
Imagine an action researcher working with a community of undocumented immigrants. A full, detailed disclosure on an official university form could actually put those participants at greater risk if that data were ever subpoenaed.
And anonymity, which the IOB loves.
Anonymity could completely erase the specific context and the specific voices that are needed to make the research politically meaningful and impactful. This is what's known as IRB creep.
The overzealous application of rules that were meant to protect people, but instead they end up stifling the very inquiry that could challenge power structures.
That's it, exactly. And Tyranny identified 5 really dramatic consequences of this for social justice researchers.
Okay, what are they?
First, the system leads to a widespread rejection of alternative forms of research. It privileges quantitative data because it seems safer and more predictable. Second, QR researchers are often just excluded from the national conversation about research policy. They don't get to help make the rules.
And that has to affect the next generation of scholars.
It does. That's the third point. Young researchers who are trained in these critical traditions, they really struggle to get their projects approved. The work that is most needed to critique power is often deemed too risky by an IRB.
And the last 2 consequences.
Fourth, the very definition of research has been bent to fit the quantitative models. And fifth, and this is the most tragic one, QR, which is trying so hard to embrace diversity and challenge stereotypes, is now sometimes seen as endorsing stereotypes by outsiders who apply these rigid standards. Researchers are forced to water down their findings to pass review.
So IRBs, which were meant to be ethical safeguards, have in some ways become tools of institutional power and methodological conservatism.
And in doing so, they can ironically cause harm by preventing research into the very systems that cause harm.
So the sources say the IRB system is stuck in a cul-de-sac. It can't easily change, so the path forward has been a political fight, not to reform it, but to get exemptions from it.
Exactly. The movement started with professional groups. Back in 2004, the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, made some really specific recommendations.
What did they recommend?
They said that research on autonomous adults that only involves things like surveys, interviews, or observing behavior in public places should just be exempt from IRB review.
The rationale being that the risk is minimal.
No greater than the risks of everyday life. It was a direct attempt to protect the basic foundational methods of the field.
And this pressure eventually led the federal government to review the whole system.
It did. In 2015, they started reviewing the Common Rule, and they proposed a much narrower definition of human subject research, work that is systematically designed to develop generalizable knowledge.
And that narrow definition matters for QR because qualitative work is often focused on very specific, local knowledge, not necessarily generalizable truth.
Precisely. And the proposal created new categories for review: excused research, expedited review, and full review.
And the big win for QR was the excused category.
A huge win. It's defined as research that involves only informal risk, no more than minimal. And the examples they gave were things like focus groups, interviews, educational tests. It was a pragmatic move that finally acknowledged that most standard QR just doesn't pose the kind of serious risk the regulations were built for.
So on one level, that's a huge practical victory. But does that pragmatic exemption satisfy the much deeper philosophical demand of critical social science and a sacred epistemology?
No, not at all. A regulatory fix is one thing. A philosophical overhaul is another. Critical social science, building on Foucault, demands a new ethical foundation centered on power and oppression, not just compliance with rules.
It's not satisfied with just being minimal risk.
It demands a decolonizing project.
And what does that mean ethically?
It means the researcher's entire ethical stance has to work outward from the core of the oppressed person's experience. It incorporates feminist, post-colonial, postmodern challenges to power. The goal isn't just to get your study approved, it's to create real spaces where oppressed voices can be heard, honored, and treated as a source of legitimate knowledge.
So the regulatory fight over IRBs is about securing the ability to do the work.
Right, but the philosophical war is about defining the researcher's ultimate moral obligation. Is your allegiance to institutional rules, or is it to justice and universal human dignity?
Wow. That was an incredibly deep journey. We've gone from the crisis in the university to its colonial past and all the way to its really challenging ethical future. Let's try to recap the big takeaways.
Let's do it.
Okay, so takeaway number 1. Remember that qualitative research is in a constant fight for its life inside the modern corporatized university.
Right, and its primary refuge, its radical path forward, is action research. This is what transforms research from an extractive process into a collaborative one, focused on real democratic change.
It's a direct challenge to that whole idea of value-free science.
A direct challenge. Okay, second takeaway. The history of QR is not simple. It's deeply, deeply tied to colonial ethnography and historical systems of power.
And the field is actively grappling with that past, which is why we see this explosion of diverse, self-critical approaches today, all trying to decenter that traditional omniscient narrator.
Exactly. And third, the ethical debate has completely shifted. It's moving away from that simplistic and often abusive utilitarianism.
The one that allowed for horrors like Tuskegee and the Tarum trade study.
Yes, and it's moving toward a much more demanding, values-driven sacred epistemology and critical social science. This new framework is all about prioritizing human dignity, shared governance, and a kind of restorative justice that focuses on healing and challenging oppression.
So we talked about the regulatory nightmare of the IRBs, the IRB creep, and the fight to get exemptions for standard QR methods by classifying them as minimal risk.
We did.
And that actually brings us to our final thought. The source material says that despite all the criticism, IRBs are stuck in a cul-de-sac. So given this new movement to get QR methods excused from review, what does it actually mean for researchers if your freedom is granted not because your work is truly respected for its ethical depth, but just because the federal government views it as posing no more than minimal risk?
It's a fantastic question. Is the path forward one of true ethical freedom, where the complexity of social justice work is finally valued? Or is it just a kind of strategic marginalization, where the institution says, oh, that work? That's fine, go do it. It's low stakes, it's not important, like the big money biomedical research.
Wow.
The ethical question really remains, if your research is only acceptable because it's considered harmless, how can it ever achieve the radical transformative justice that these new ethical frameworks demand?
Something to think about as you apply this knowledge and, as you said earlier, choose your allegiance.
Yes,
That is a vital distinction to end on. Thank you for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.